So this is our opportunity to talk about people on the move in search of meaning. Hold on, something's being handed to me. Thanks. And here the real concern is the question is, what is it? What is it about young people nowadays that feel like there's a hole to fill? They are feeling somehow estranged from the society in which they live, a little bit sort of unanchored, untethered, unsettled. And what we're seeing around the world is a simultaneous rise of, on the one hand, the Ku Klux Klan in this country, which has been growing over the past 15 years, and on the other hand, violent extremist groups such as ISIS. What is it about their appeal? How do we better understand it? And how do we as philanthropists in the room think about how to fill that hole in a very different way? So we're going to hear from Will McCants, who's at Brookings Institution. I'm not going to give long descriptions. Will was at the State Department and was a key advisor on this question. And I think what you all know by now is that Will literally wrote the book on ISIS. And so Pak YAHYA of Indonesia, from the NU party there, had opportunity, and he is now working in the United States and with the University of Vienna in Austria. And we'll be able to ask him a good deal about Indonesia, of course, the largest Muslim country in the world. And then finally, SHAMIL. IDRISS. SHAMIL runs something called Search for Common Ground, which is an organization that has done an enormous amount of good work in the world of conflict resolution, conflict prevention. And in a prior life, he, in some ways, invented the world of virtual exchanges, which he has brought in to Search for Common Ground as well. So just so that we can even understand the nature of the problem, SHAMIL, I'm going to start with you and ask you about the various myths out there about what is a motivation for joining these kinds of groups. What is it that we hear are the reasons and end up shaping our responses that turn out not to be so?
Great, thank you, Jane, very much. As a quick precursor to answering your question, I just wanted to explain a little bit about what I am and what I am not. So I'm not a scholar. I've got, like Will, or a religious scholar, like YAHYA. I run an international nonprofit organization. So what I'll share with you today is drawn from our lessons learned from the local teams that we support and partners with whom we work in 36 different countries around the world, doing work at the local community level with youth groups, working in prison systems, working with governments to try to diversify their approaches to this issue so they're not just the sharp end of the spear, tough-ended approaches. So that's where the lessons are taken from. That and the field of virtual exchange, which briefly connects young adults across the US and Western Europe with their peers in Muslim-majority cultures, and we've learned a lot because you can engage young people that way that are outside the normal exchange experiences. So based on those experiences and also their limitations, first, what I think some of the myths are, there's not as much a correlation as people oftentimes posit between degree of religiosity and participation in extremist movements. You find oftentimes young people who join ISIS or join al-Nusra Front or any of these groups oftentimes convert 1 week and suddenly are off in Syria fighting, or they haven't had a history of being particularly religious or devout. So there's not as much of a correlation there as people might expect, which is not to say that there's not a theological base to some of ISIS's ideology and what they're trying to appeal to. There very much is. There's not as much of a correlation as people would anticipate and oftentimes posit between levels of poverty or joblessness and participation in these groups. I think Will offer a little bit of additional color to that, but in terms of a one-to-one existence, the more unemployment you have, the more participation you have in ISIS just doesn't hold true. And third, there's not as much of a correlation as people oftentimes posit between lack of education and participation in these groups, particularly among some of the leadership of these groups, which are oftentimes quite highly educated. It's a very dangerous space to make any generalizations, which is frustrating for a group like this, because generalizations are helpful in determining what are we going to do about it. So I'm going to make a couple generalizations with a massive caveat that, as I was reflecting about kind of the work that we do, local context is really everything. And what causes a young person in Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria to join Boko Haram, and a Moroccan in El Hoceima in northern Morocco to run to Syria, or some young woman in Colorado to go, they're very different, very different. But if it's not primarily those three things, what is it? What we found, and I think some of the more credible research shows, is that some of the common factors are a sense of alienation, marginalization, humiliation, a sense of powerlessness in the face of perceived injustice. That these kinds of emotional experiences and somewhat you might call identity crises are much closer markers of the likelihood of a young person to look for belonging, as is the title of the session, in a violent extremist movement. And the last thing I'd point out on that, which makes it challenging but also gives us clues to how to address these issues, is that it's not so different from what we've seen for decades drives the recruitment of young people into urban gangs, into child soldier movements, into drug cartels, and so we actually have a lot of lessons to learn and draw upon, and we don't have to think that everything has to be new because this has to do somehow with Islam, and maybe we don't know so much about Islam, some of us, and so we're feeling like, well, we have no clue then. No, we actually know a lot from these other settings, and there's a lot of lessons that are directly relevant to this issue.
And are some of the tools the same? That is to say, for example, there are various community groups that have been able to work with parents in the city of Los Angeles or someplace where there is gang violence to help them, help the parents, both see it coming, seeing that their child might be attracted, and to find ways to intervene and offer a different path.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you see with most of those movements, their starting point for any young person is, you're powerful, we need you. We have a just cause, whatever it is, and you are a driver of change and we need you. And too many of the efforts that are framed around countering violent extremism approach young people as, you poor young people, you're marginalized, you're alienated, you need our help. And it's not the most empowering thing. So the second thing that you see happening oftentimes is stuff that seeks to talk at young people doesn't go nearly as well as things that give young people a voice. You know, I was talking yesterday in a small group. I'll share it with the full group as well, just because I'll never forget it from that Michael Moore film, Bowling for Columbine, when, for those who saw it, he's trying to find out, well, why is there so much gun violence in America? Because you have an equal per capita gun ownership in a country like Canada or Switzerland, so what's going on here? And at one point, he's interviewing the heavy metal rocker Marilyn Manson, because the kids who shot up Columbine High School were fans of his music. And so there was some blowback against his music afterwards. And so Moore asked him, if you could talk to Dylan Klebold and the other boy who shot up the school the morning of the attack, what would you say to them? And Manson didn't miss a beat. He immediately said, I wouldn't say anything, I'd listen to them. That's what nobody did. And that, I think, is a profound lesson that groups that work with young people really need to heed. Providing avenues where young people can be heard and express themselves, talk about the things that upset them, and where the goal is not simply, let's keep this group from becoming violent, but it's actually, let's recognize young people for the powerful change makers that, in fact, they always have been across history and in almost every culture, and let's provide more constructive pathways for them to act out that, change-making passion.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to turn to you and narrow the aperture for a moment and focus in on ISIS in particular, because you've recently done a study on who is being attracted to ISIS, and to some degree why.
Sure. We just did a study. We were looking at the attack data we have since 2011, and also the data about people who have traveled from abroad to join ISIS, to try and give us a sense of what's really driving this movement. And in the beginning, I think you should make a distinction between two things in your head. One is what drives someone locally, say in Syria or Iraq, to join, and then what drives a foreigner to leave their family, leave their friends, travel abroad and join. Those are two different incentive structures that are driving those things. One has to do with reasons for joining an insurgency. If you're part of a war-torn country, there's usually an economic incentive involved, or you're doing it out of fear. You want to be with the guys, not against the guys that have the guns, those sorts of things. When you look at the foreigners, there's a different set of incentives. And some of this really comes out when you look at a combination of factors. There's usually not one thing that's driving people to join, but a series of things. And in the past, folks who've studied this have identified a few of them. One has to do, as SHAMIL says, with peer networks. If your peers join a militant underground organization, you're more likely to join up than not. So a lot of this has to do with peer pressure. Also in Europe, there is a countercultural aspect to this. I mean, nothing is more countercultural today than ISIS. So it is a rebellion against mainstream Muslim values in Europe, and it's a rebellion against mainstream Western values as well. And I think this is one reason why you find a lot of new converts that are joining. They don't particularly know the religious theology very well. They don't know the jurisprudence very well, but there's something exciting about rebelling in this way. You also have a lot of criminals who get involved. And one reason is, of course, they want to find some way to justify their criminality through religion, but there's another overlooked aspect, and that is, for many of them, this violence is redemptive. They feel guilty about their religious pasts. They feel that it's an opportunity to cleanse their sins in the eyes of God on the battlefield. But there are also some structural issues that are harder to get at. And the studies in this area have, by and large, been pretty weak because you are dealing with a small number of people. So it's always hard to derive big conclusions. But our study led us in some strange directions. And I will share it with you with the big caveat that some of this we don't understand for ourselves. And we actually sat on these results for months because we were too hesitant to share them in public. Some of them you might suspect has to do with youth unemployment and urbanization. But it's not a binary. It's not unemployment or not, urbanization or not. It matters if these things are in a certain range. And before or after that range, it doesn't seem to have any impact. So for youth unemployment, it was generally between 10 and 30%. Before that didn't matter, after didn't matter. Also urbanization between 65 and 80%. When these two things interacted with each other, they tended to produce even more fighters than if these were separate. The third thing we found, though, that was driving a lot of the foreigners to travel abroad to fight was the reason that we were reticent to share it. And that had to do with the fact that it mattered a lot whether you came from a French-speaking country or not. And we initially didn't quite know what to make of it. We're still hesitant, but we think it has to do something with the way that French political culture handles secularism. In many countries that were influenced by the French colonial legacy, but also in France itself, secularism means removing symbols of religiosity. And we think that this may in part explain why French speaking was so correlated with driving foreigners. It didn't have anything to do with the language. It was a proxy for something else. But what was fascinating is these three factors working together in concert ended up explaining a lot more of the travel than otherwise.
So in essence, if you're saying you must not wear the veil, you're disrespecting their own value system and their own religion. It would be as though you said, you must not wear a cross or you must not wear a yarmulke. Is that, am I going
That's exactly
too far
right. And
this?
the two countries in Western Europe that ban the wearing of the hijab in school are Belgium and France. And it's also the case that many of these networks emerge among areas of dense urban populations where there's a high level of youth employment as well. And I think that's one reason why we've seen this series of attacks over the last few months in France and Belgium in particular.
So I think you describe, SHAMIL, a world that sounds very much like adolescence, period, right? That sense of not knowing your own place, feeling powerless, feeling humiliated. Where I wanted to take us, Will, for a moment is to where there may be actual grievances. I'm not saying that this would ever justify violence, but where you have sort of overlaid over that emotional unease that so many young people have right now, and not only young people, but so many people have right now, if you have an overlay of a sense of real injustice. Yesterday when I was talking to Chris Stone, I reminded him this was not the first refugee crisis in Europe involving Muslims, right? So we had thousands of Muslims murdered, men and boys, and another 25,000 expelled from Bosnia and back in the 90s. Both Europe and the US were very slow to act.
That's right. And that's one of the major drivers of young people to go travel abroad. And the obvious one that often gets unsaid is the fact that they are reacting to large-scale suffering of their co-religionists. I mean, if you ask foreign fighters who are transiting into Syria, they would answer the same way foreign fighters would have answered back in the 90s with what was happening in Bosnia. They feel that the international community had abandoned their co-religionists and they were going there to defend them.
And SHAMIL, are we hearing any of that from former recruits who have since renounced violent extremism?
Yeah, but more so even than that, the sort of lack of the international community to respond to certain crises. It's sort of the view that more than that, there is an aggressive assault on Muslim countries and Muslim cultures driven by the West. And that narrative, when I was at the UN, and we would see that narrative very powerfully articulated in lots of different ways, that as decolonization happened across the African continent, for instance, in the 60s, colonization increased in Muslim societies, that as Western troops and forces left all these other regions, Latin America and elsewhere, they invaded again and again Muslim countries to secure oil, to maintain a certain autocracy and power or whatever else might be. So we're hearing that grievance around, hey, there hasn't been the same kind of responsiveness when there's an attack in Paris and there's an attack in Beirut on the same week. All the world's leaders descend on Paris and they march in the streets and nobody pays any attention to Beirut. So you hear that. But the other thing that you hear is, no, it's more than that. There's actually a proactive assault. And it's a difficult narrative for people to engage with because when you look at issues like troops on the ground, invasions of countries across the Arab world or whatever, it's a very powerful, it's quite easy to tell that narrative and to tell it very emotionally, to tell it with sufficient statistics and lots of visuals, and it's powerful.
But to be clear, do you argue that these are causes or these are overlays and justifications and...
It's funny, I almost don't think it matters. I mean, if I had this conversation when bin Laden, before ISIS, when bin Laden would say, I saw the towers in Beirut coming down by American-supplied Israeli war jets, and I had the idea of bringing the American Twin Towers down. Okay, so when he says that, whether that was actually his motivation or was just something he knew would speak to a lot of people, the real issue is, well, that speaks to a lot of people, right? So I don't want to get into, well, are people genuinely upset about this, or are they using it cynically to recruit people to a movement that has other purposes? The point is, it resonates very powerfully, that narrative.
So, Pak YAHYA, it's striking to me that Indonesia, or when Will looks at the various sources of both local fighters and foreign fighters, Indonesia is not on the list. Why are so few people Indonesians being attracted to jihad?
First, thank you, Jean Wills, for bringing me here. It's a great honor. It's a tremendous opportunity to learn, meeting so many knowledgeable people in many different fields. Well, what I would want to say is that Islam is not monolithic, it's heterogeneous. There are several different stream of theology, different interpretations on Islam, as variant interpretation on Islam that grows and established to be traditions. And if I would give a picture that there are two ways for Muslim to see Islam. First is Islam, a religion that is meant to alter the world, meant to substitute the reality, the existing reality of the world, or Islam as a contribution to the existing civilizational history of humanity. That is the basic view of the way Muslims see their religion. In Indonesia, we have a vast majority of Muslims. We have 85 to 90% of Muslim Indonesia. That means more than 220 million Muslim in Indonesia. But when our the founding fathers of our state established Indonesia, they established it not as an Islamic state, but a pluralistic secular state. So this has something to do with the tradition of Islam, the variant interpretation on Islam that has been dominant in Indonesia. Because in a huge population of Muslim like Indonesia, you can see more easily the relation between the different way of viewing Islam among the Muslims themselves, and the orientation of their way to manifest Islam. So, because in Indonesia we have like all the spectrum of Islamic tradition we have there. So that if you ask about where these people who join the extremist movement come from, in Indonesia you can easily see a constant, domain of the tradition of the variant interpretation on Islam. But what we have to be the dominant variant interpretation of Islam in Indonesia is the tradition that see Islam as the contribution to the existing civilizational heritage that we have in Indonesia. That makes Indonesian Muslim have more sense of belonging to their indigenous culture and civilizational heritage, and then prevent them from the appeal, from being lured by the appeal of extremist propaganda. But there are people that indeed vulnerable to the appeal of extremist propaganda. In Indonesia, their view, because we, the majority of Muslim in Indonesia, we intentionally strive and build mechanism to block the influence of this extremist propaganda in Indonesia. So, but we see that in the last few decades, the threat of radicalism, the propaganda of radicalism and extremism in Indonesia has been getting stronger because there is a global source that support the propaganda. So what we are thinking now is we need a global strive to deal with it globally.
What's interesting is picking up Queen Sylvia's theme is that notion of belonging to your traditional culture. But another thing about the work you do is that you encourage that sense of belonging to nation. There's a sense of nationhood, culture, and faith, and allowing them to be aligned. Will, I wanted to take you to that sense of nationhood for a moment, because one of your findings that you shared with me earlier was that it was easier to recruit from states that were not competent, states that were not providing reliable services. And I know on the other hand, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, they're offering services as well as an ideology. Give us a sense of both that finding, but also the appeal, ISIS's unique appeal in offering a homeland, which makes it quite different from Al-Qaeda and other such groups.
Sure. Yeah, so I have to say this finding was also frustrating for me because my own bias cuts against these economic or structural explanations for jihadist violence. I tend to dismiss them out of hand, but it was hard to ignore that when you looked at rates of electricity provision, infant mortality rates, and you matched them against the attack data and the production of foreign fighters, more often than not, countries that were better at service provision had lower rates of radicalizations, right? So was sort of an average across all the countries, so we were interested in the ones that were above average or below average. And the ones that were below average, many of them were better at service provision. And it had nothing to do with the type of government. It didn't matter if it was authoritarian or democratic. What mattered was government service provision. So there seems to be a strong relationship between the two. For the Islamic State, and part of its unique appeal in contrast to Al-Qaeda, and one reason it's attracted so many people, is that it is holding itself out not just as a homeland for other Sunni Muslims, but as the return of God's kingdom on earth. They are unique among jihadist groups in claiming to have reestablished the ancient Islamic empire, and they also teach that the world is coming to an end soon after its establishment. And for many foreigners that are attracted to the group, not the locals, but for the foreigners, it is a powerful recruiting pitch. And SHAMIL is totally right. A lot of these people that go there, they don't know Islamic history or theology very well, but it's the religious vision that is very inspiring, and the opportunity for many, not just in Europe, but in parts of the Middle East and North Africa, to participate in a state-building enterprise, to have a say in how they are to be governed, I think taps into something pretty deep, not just in what motivates a youth to activism, but also a youth living in the Middle East who may have finished high school or college and doesn't have a lot of opportunities locally. Some of them will go fight for the Islamic State, and even if they don't go fight, they express admiration intermingled with disdain for the Islamic State because they have been able to, by force of arms and will, to establish a state, defying the international community and also defying the local authoritarians in the neighborhood.
So we've identified three problems. One is disaffected youth. Another is the combination of politics with an interpretation of the faith. And the third, which we haven't talked about, but I'm sure we will, is social media. So I want to look at the three problems and see how they can be flipped into solutions. So I'm going to start, SHAMIL, with you. What is the role and the potential role of young people in addressing some of these dangers and in helping one another?
Yeah, I mean, separate from this particular issue, young people have a particular association with violence that's just deeply troubling. That's the leading cause of death for young people globally between the ages of 15 and 29. And young people are oftentimes disproportionately engaged either by being induced or being forced to participate as perpetrators of violence. And so we have what I think is not an overly idealistic. I think it's grounded in absolute reality and reams of evidence that young people are the primary drivers of social change. Older people oftentimes get the Nobel Prizes, but oftentimes the movements start on whether it's college campuses or youth groups, and so young people have a tremendous role to play. The myth or the promise of interactive media for someone like me who believes in the importance of cross-cultural engagement, peace building, this kind of thing, is really, it's the best time in history to be alive. More and more people every week are able to communicate with one another, and that's just going to grow more and more. Fantastic. The way this is playing out as we are in this global transitional period of incredible disruption, though, is that oftentimes, though, with new media technologies, we can, for instance, subscribe to lots of different sources of information. A lot of us will choose those sources of information that reinforce our pre-existing worldviews. So the follower of CNN and Fox are living in two totally different worlds, let alone Al Jazeera or whatever. And similarly, though, we can have social networks that will bridge all kinds of differences. You don't see a lot of social networks that actually bridge the religious and the secular, the conservative and the liberal. And I think this is not an issue of Islam or violent extremism. This is just an issue of what's going on as the world adapts to all these new technologies that are evolving much faster than our, frankly, political will or human maturity to use them to the best of our ability. So coming back to the positive, we reference this field of virtual exchange. The basic concept of virtual exchange, as an example, is one of the best ways to open up people's minds and perspectives is to support them to study abroad or go on an exchange program. That's unfortunately an experience that is really only taken advantage of or accessible to less than 1% of the global youth populations. And the plurality of young people who participate on those go on exchanges between the US and Western Europe.